He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just raised one trembling finger and said, "That's the man who shot my daddy." And in that moment, time seemed to crack in half. The courtroom fell silent, so silent you could hear the flicker of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A 10-year-old boy, no taller than the wooden railing he stood behind, had just turned an entire legal proceeding upside down. The officer he pointed at, Detective Carl Brantley, sat stiffly in his seat, face drained of color. His lawyer jerked upright, muttering something under his breath. The judge looked over his glasses, the gavel frozen in midair. No one moved. No one breathed. The boy's name was Micah Rowe, 10 years old, 5th grade. Favorite color? Blue. Favorite food? Cinnamon waffles with extra syrup. Before this day, Micah had never been in a courtroom, never seen a judge, and had certainly never testified in front of a crowd of reporters, lawyers, and strangers who all seemed too big, too white, and too angry. But he remembered everything. That night, the yelling, the bang, and the way his father, Kendrick Rowe, slumped to the floor, his chest erupting with blood like someone had uncorked a bottle inside him. Micah had been hiding behind the hallway closet door, clutching his Spider-Man blanket to his chest. He hadn't screamed then either. He just watched, listened, memorized. His mother, Lila, sat behind him in court, eyes rimmed red from sleeplessness. She had begged the prosecutors not to let Micah testify. He was too young, she said, too small, too damaged. But Micah had insisted. "I remember," he told her, "and they won't believe it unless I say it." So now here he was, a little black boy standing at the edge of an oak witness stand, facing down the system that swallowed his father whole. The DA, Karen Liu, leaned forward slowly, unsure of how to proceed after such a bombshell. "Micah," she said gently, her voice trembling, "are you absolutely sure? The man you're pointing to, Detective Brantley's the same man from that night." Micah didn't blink. "He had a scar on his chin," he said. "Right there." He mimicked the exact angle of the scar on Brantley's jaw. He smelled like cigarettes and cheap cologne. He had a gold watch. And he said to my dad, "You think I won't pull this trigger just because your kid is listening?" Gasps rippled across the courtroom. The court stenographer's fingers faltered for the first time all day. Brantley's lawyer, a sharp-jawed man named Malcolm Dorsey, shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay. The child is clearly traumatized as constructing fantasies based on grief and media bias." The judge, a stern white man with a polished bench and an even more polished legacy, banged the gavel. "Sustained. The jury will disregard the last statement." But no one in that room was going to forget it. Because here's what they knew, even if they couldn't say it. Kendrick Rowe, a black man with no prior record, had been pulled over for a supposed broken taillight. Minutes later, he was dead, shot in the chest, in front of his home, while his son watched from behind a door. The officer involved claimed Kendrick reached for something, though no weapon was found. The body cam footage malfunctioned. The incident report was redacted. And somehow, the entire thing was swept under the rug until now. Until Micah. Until a child did what grown men hadn't dared. He named the killer out loud. Outside the courtroom, protesters gathered with signs. Justice for Kendrick, end qualified immunity, Black Lives Matter. Inside, it was chaos wrapped in procedure. Brantley didn't testify. His defense hinged on a technicality that no clear evidence tied him to the scene. But Micah's words hit harder than evidence. Because sometimes, truth doesn't arrive in pixels or paperwork. Sometimes it comes from the mouth of a child who should have been playing kickball instead of burying his father. And still, despite everything, Micah's testimony was not enough. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. When they returned, the room tensed. The foreman, an older white woman with a trembling voice, stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Detective Carl Brantley, not guilty on all charges." The words fell like lead. Micah didn't cry. Lila did. She sobbed into her hands as the world around her crumbled a second time. Brantley stood up slowly, adjusting his collar. He didn't smile. He didn't thank the jury. He just walked out of the courtroom with the same arrogant silence he'd worn on his badge for years. The reporters swarmed. The judge cleared the room. But Micah stayed. He just sat there, alone now, looking at the empty chair where the man had sat. The man who killed his father. It was over. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. What they didn't know was that Micah's words, simple, unshaken, uncoached, had been broadcast all over the country. Live. People saw him. Not as a statistic. Not as black child, victim of police tragedy. But as Micah. Brave. Smart. Unrelenting. And one of those people was a woman named Imani Hart. Civil rights attorney. Harvard-educated. Black. And done watching black families get buried under the weight of polite injustice. She called Lila that same night. "I saw your son," she said. "And if you'll let me, I will burn this system down brick by brick until someone pays." The next morning, she filed a federal civil suit. Not just against Brantley, against the entire NYPD precinct. Wrongful death. Destruction of evidence. Pattern of racial violence. It lit a fire in the city. Overnight, Micah became a symbol. Protesters held up photos of him at rallies. Celebrities posted his clip. Politicians pretended to care. But none of that mattered to Micah. All he wanted was to make sure no other boy had to see what he saw. That summer, the Department of Justice opened a new investigation. Micah testified again, this time in front of a federal jury. No judge with buddies on the force. No loopholes. Just truth. And when they showed the enhanced footage because, yes, someone in tech finally recovered the corrupted fillet, all came together. The angle, the timing, the scar, and the voice. "You think I won't pull this trigger just because your kid is listening?" Micah's words weren't just remembered. They were confirmed. Brantley was arrested. Again, this time for federal civil rights violations. He was convicted. Sentenced. And still, Micah didn't smile. He just whispered to his mom, "Does this mean Daddy can rest now?" Lila nodded, eyes full. Because in a world that rarely listens to black voices, a 10-year-old boy had forced the world to hear him. And they couldn't unhear it. The courtroom in Washington, D.C. was nothing like the one in New York. It was colder, quieter, and somehow more sterile, like truth had to pass through metal detectors and polished marble before anyone was allowed to hear it. But that didn't bother Micah. He stood beside Imani Hart, wearing a suit that was too big at the shoulders and shoes that clicked too loudly against the floor. This time, people believed him before he even opened his mouth. Federal agents had combed through years of Brantley's arrest records. The paper trail revealed a history of stops, searches, and undocumented encounters, nearly all involving Black or Latino men. Internal complaints buried under administrative leave notices. Camera footage marked as incomplete over and over again. It wasn't just Brantley. It was systemic. But none of it hit harder than the voice in that audio file recovered, enhanced, undeniable. "I told you, Kendrick. You run your mouth one more time, and I'll make sure your kid grows up an orphan." That line played on the courtroom speakers, and the gallery gasped. Even some of the jurors, professionals used to horrific evidence, dropped their gaze. Micah didn't blink. He'd heard those words every night in his dreams. Now everyone else had to live with them too. Brantley tried to say it was doctored, that his voice had been manipulated, that the woke mob was orchestrating a witch hunt. But voice forensics confirmed it. 98.7% voice print match. The scar, the gold watch, the cigarettes, the motive, the rage. It all connected. And this time, it wasn't a local jury with neighbors on the force. This was federal. This was public. This was bigger than Brantley. But even as the guilty verdict echoed through the room, Micah didn't smile. He didn't jump for joy like the reporters wanted. He simply looked over at his mother, who held her chest with both hands and mouth. You did it. Later that night, they sat alone in a D.C. hotel room. CNN played quietly in the background. The news ticker read, "Former NYPD officer convicted in federal court after child witness breaks silence." Micah didn't look at the screen. He was staring at the tiny family photo he carried in his backpack, the one where his dad was laughing in front of a beat-up barbecue grill, holding a spatula in one hand and Micah in the other. There was ketchup on his shirt. His eyes were squinting from the sun. "Can we go home now?" Micah asked quietly. Lila wrapped her arm around him. "Yeah, baby, we can go home." But home had changed. Back in Brooklyn, people looked at Micah differently. Not like a kid, not even like a survivor. He was a symbol now, whether he wanted to be or not. He couldn't walk past the corner store without someone whispering, "That's him." He couldn't sit in the park without someone trying to take a photo. And at school, teachers tiptoed around him like he might collapse at any moment. He missed being invisible. Imani Hart warned them it might happen. She offered to move them out of the city into a quiet suburb. But Lila refused. "This is our neighborhood. Micah isn't going to disappear. He's going to grow up here. Proud." So they stayed. But it wasn't easy. Some neighbors celebrated him. Others didn't, especially the ones with cops in the family. Tensions flared. Twice someone sprayed the word liar on their stoop. One morning, they found a stuffed dog hanging from their tree, painted red. Micah didn't say a word. He just swept it into the trash himself. It wasn't until the fall, when school resumed fully, that something shifted. On a damp October morning, Micah arrived at school to find the bulletin board in the hallway covered in paper cutouts of hands. On each hand, a student had written one thing they admired about him. Brave, told the truth, didn't let them shut him up, made me believe in something again. And at the center, a quote from the very moment it all began. "That's the man who shot my daddy." Micah Rowe, age 10. Micah stared at it for a long time. And for the first time in months, his chest felt warm. He didn't want to be a symbol. But maybe being one wasn't all bad. Meanwhile, the lawsuit Imani filed continued to grow. More families came forward, people who had lost sons, brothers, fathers to routine stops that turned violent. Some hadn't spoken in years. Others were still scared. But Micah gave them courage. And the more they spoke, the more the story expanded. It wasn't just about Brantley anymore. It was about a precinct that had been swallowing black lives like clockwork, protected by bureaucracy and silence. Imani called it a machine made of paperwork and indifference. The DOJ launched a full civil rights investigation into the precinct, the first in over 2 decades. Dozens of officers were suspended. 3 captains were fired. 2 supervisors turned whistleblowers. The city offered settlements, but the Rows refused. They wanted change, real change. In the spring, Imani called a press conference. She stood beside Micah and Lila on the courthouse steps, camera flashes exploding like fireworks. This child did not testify for money. He did not speak for fame. He spoke because his father deserved truth and his community deserved justice, she said. So let me be clear. We do not want her checks. We want her reform. She listed demands. Body camera footage made publicly available within 48 hours. An independent civilian oversight board with real power. Mandatory racial bias training reviewed by outside experts. And most controversially, a ban on all pretextual traffic stops unless there was documented, visible evidence of criminal activity. The mayor balked. The police union howled. But the people? They marched. Brooklyn, Harlem, the Bronx, Queens. Micah didn't march. He didn't chant. He just watched from the sidewalk as the city moved in his name. And then came the day he never expected. The governor's office called. They wanted Micah to speak at a signing ceremony for the Community Protection and Justice Act, a sweeping bill crafted in response to everything he'd ignited. Lila said no at first. He's a kid. He's not your mascot. But Micah said yes. I want them to see I'm not scared. So on a rainy Tuesday in June, Micah took the stage. Standing on a wooden crate behind the podium so he could reach the mic, he cleared his throat and said, I'm not here to thank you, because this should have happened before my daddy died. I'm here to remind you there are other kids out there who haven't lost their parents yet. Don't wait until they do. The room went still again. That line became a headline. That line made history. And later that night, as thunder rolled across the sky and the ink dried on new legislation, Lila tucked her son in a bed and said, You changed the world today. Micah blinked at the ceiling. I just told the truth. Yes, she whispered. And sometimes that's the most dangerous thing you can do. He didn't reply, but he didn't need to, because tomorrow they'd wake up in a city slightly less cruel, slightly more honest. And the boy who pointed at a cop and spoke the truth, he'd keep walking forward. Not just as a witness, not just as a victim, but as proof that even the smallest voice can shatter the silence. The summer after the bill passed, the city felt different. Not fixed, not healed, but different, like something long buried under concrete had started to crack and breathe. Micah turned 11 that August. No party, no candles, just a quiet dinner with Lila at the same tiny kitchen table where Kendrick used to hum old Stevie Wonder songs while slicing tomatoes. They didn't talk about the trial or the laws or the reporters still camped outside their building. They just ate chicken and rice and talked about dinosaurs. Because some days, that was all Micah needed to stay grounded, not legacy, but simplicity. Still, the world kept pulling at him. His face was in textbooks, now social justice curriculum piloted across New York public schools. Micah's law. Some call the legislation he helped inspire. He didn't like that. It felt too big, too final, like it left no room for him to grow, because he was still growing. And so was the pressure. At school, a teacher accidentally introduced him to a classroom visitor as the kid who changed policing in New York. Micah just nodded and looked at the floor. At recess, a group of boys tried to corner him, saying he was famous now and probably rich. He walked away silent. But the real breaking point came in September. The PDA wanted to name the library after his father. They meant well. Kendrick had volunteered there every Saturday, organizing reading time for kids. He'd built shelves, donated books. Everyone loved Kendrick. Still, when the proposal came up during the meeting, an older white father bald, red-faced, raised his hand and asked, Wouldn't it be controversial? I mean, given what happened with the police. Micah was there, sitting quietly in the back, waiting for his mom. He heard every word. That night, he said nothing. He just went home, curled up in bed, and stared at the ceiling fan, watching it spin, around and around. Lila came in to check on him. You okay, baby? I'm tired, Mom. Of what? Of being brave all the time. That sentence stayed with her for days. She called him Monty. He needs a break, Lila said. We all do. And so they left, just for a while. A month in Georgia, where Kendrick's mother still lived in a creaky yellow house with a porch swing and a backyard full of hummingbirds. No press, no lawsuits, no headlines, just Micah and a pond and the sound of cicadas. There for the first time since the trial, he really laughed chasing frogs in the mud, falling asleep to his grandma's stories about Kendrick as a boy. You know, she whispered one night, your daddy once stole my broomstick because he thought he could ride it like Harry Potter. Micah giggled. Did he fall? Flat on his face. Georgia gave them space to remember who they were before the world turned upside down. But even in peace, the ripple of truth kept moving. Back in New York, more officers were being investigated. The oversight board the one Imani had fought for launched its first inquiry into racial bias within traffic stop procedures. Data revealed what black communities had always known. Officers were 7 times more likely to pull over a black driver for minor infractions. The city's police commissioner resigned. Not publicly disgraced, but not quietly either. And more importantly, new leadership stepped in. For the first time in NYPD's history, the civilian oversight director was a black woman, Maya Dupree, a former public defender, relentless, sharp, and absolutely immune to political theater. When asked on her first day if she believed the department could be reformed, she said, "Not overnight, but you start with accountability, and you build from there." Micah saw the interview on TV from Georgia. He didn't say anything, but he smiled. He and Lila returned to Brooklyn in October. Their building still had cracks. The neighborhood still carried scars. But there were also murals, now one of Kendrick, painted on the side of the community center. Him holding Micah on his shoulders, both smiling wide under a blue sky. Below it, someone had spray-painted in careful letters. Truth didn't save Kendrick, but it saved the next boy. Micah stood in front of it for a long time, staring. His fingers brushed against the wall's texture, paint thick over brick, like it was protecting something underneath. That fall, something shifted in him. He started writing. Not speeches, not statements. Stories. He wrote about Kendrick, not the way he died, but the way he lived. How he always danced while cooking. How he knew every word to every Luther Vandross song. How he once built Micah a bike from parts he'd found in a junkyard, just to surprise him for his 7th birthday. He wrote it all down in a battered notebook he kept under his pillow. And then, during a school open mic, he read one aloud. It wasn't about race, or violence, or justice. It was about love. A boy and his father at Coney Island, sharing a corn dog, getting mustard on their shirts, laughing as seagulls dive-bombed them from the sky. The whole room listened. And at the end, no one clapped at first, not out of apathy, but awe. Then the applause came, and it didn't stop. Afterward, his English teacher pulled him aside. "You ever think about writing a book?" Micah shrugged. "I'm just writing so I don't forget." The teacher smiled. That's what all great writers say. And for the first time, Micah thought, maybe I could be something else. Not just a boy who testified. Not just a voice that broke silence. Maybe I could be a storyteller, a creator, a builder of memory. That idea grew over the winter. He started collecting stories from other kids, some who had lost parents, others who just felt invisible. He interviewed them, wrote their words in the margins of his notebook, turned them into short poems, flash fiction, little truths stitched together like patches on a quilt. He called it The Things We Carry. Imani read a few pages during one of her visits. Her eyes welled. "You need to publish this," she said. Micah blinked. "Why?" "Because you're telling the part of the story no courtroom ever sees." By spring, a small local press offered to help. It wasn't flashy, no big money, but it was real, physical, his name in ink. Micah Rowe, age 11, author. His book became required reading in 5 middle schools by the end of the year. At the launch event, a girl raised her hand and asked him, "Do you still think about that day in court?" Micah paused. "Yes," he said, "but not the part where I pointed. I remember what came after. When I walked out and my mom held my hand tighter than she ever had. I remember thinking, maybe this isn't just my story anymore. Maybe it's ours." That night, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Lila watched her son sit on their fire escape with his notebook open, scribbling something in the fading light. He looked so much like Kendrick in that moment it made her chest ache. And yet the ache didn't feel like loss this time. It felt like legacy, like maybe, somehow, what was stolen had given birth to something no bullet could kill. A voice, a truth, a boy with a pen and a memory. Still writing, still healing, still here. By the time Micah turned 12, something remarkable had begun to happen. His name was no longer just spoken in legal circles or activist spaces. It had started to echo in places of policy, art, and literature. But more importantly, Micah was no longer just remembered for what he endured. He was becoming known for what he created. His book, The Things We Carry, spread far beyond New York. Educators in Chicago, Baltimore, Atlanta, and Oakland began requesting classroom sets. Writers reached out to him, real writers asking if he'd do interviews, readings, panels. One invitation came from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Another came from the Library of Congress. Each time, Lila asked, "Are you sure you want to go?" And Michael would answer, "If I don't tell it, someone else will, and they won't get it right." He wasn't angry anymore, not in the way he used to be. The rage had softened into something quieter, a sharpened clarity. He understood now that pain, when carried too long, either burns you alive or becomes fuel. Micah chose fuel, but justice real, structural justice moved slowly. For every reform passed, there were 5 new roadblocks. For every bad officer fired, another one rose up to take his place. The headlines shifted to new tragedies, new names, new mothers crying in microphones. Sometimes Micah asked Imani, "Is it always going to be like this?" And she would tell him the truth, "Unless people like you keep making noise." Yes. So he kept going. At a community meeting in Brooklyn, Micah met a boy named Isaiah. 14. Tall, all knees and elbows. Isaiah's brother had been killed during a raid 2 years earlier. They never found the officer responsible. "I read your book," Isaiah told him. "Made me want to write something too." "Did you?" Micah asked. Isaiah nodded and pulled out a crumpled notebook from his backpack. Inside were pages of verse raw, unfiltered, powerful. Micah read it all, every word, then handed it back and said, "You should publish this." Isaiah laughed. "Yeah, right." "No, I mean it," Micah insisted. "We'll start something. A group, a magazine, a way for kids like us to be heard." And just like that, the Row Collective was born. Named after Kendrick, but built by the children left behind. They started with 4 writers: Micah, Isaiah, a girl named Priya whose father had been deported, and a kid from Bed-Stuy named Leon who had spent 6 months in juvie for stealing diapers for his baby sister. By spring, the collective had 30 contributors, including visual artists and spoken word performers. They published a zine, then a website. Then they held a showcase at the Brooklyn Public Library that drew hundreds of people: students, parents, teachers, reporters. It wasn't just storytelling. It was a movement. And Micah? He wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a mentor, a leader, a bridge between grief and growth. But then, in the winter of his 13th year, something unexpected happened. He was invited to the annual NYPD Reform Summit. The same institution that once tried to discredit him now wanted him to speak about youth impact and truth-telling. Lila was skeptical. "Feels like they just want good press." Micah agreed, but something in him said go. "If we don't show up," he told her, "they'll say we didn't care enough to try." So he went. He wore the same wrinkled coat from that first trial, not out of nostalgia, but defiance. Let them see how small he once was. Let them remember. His speech wasn't long, only 5 minutes, but it ended like this. "When I was 10, I told the truth, and no one believed me. When I was 11, I told it again, and they did. Now I'm 13, and I've learned something. Truth only matters if it makes people uncomfortable enough to change. So if you came here for comfort, I'm not your speaker. But if you came here to remember what it costs to ignore a child's voice, then listen. And do better. Not someday. Now. Afterward, a handful of officers approached him. Some with tears. Some just with silence. One young black sergeant said, "My little boy's 9. He saw your speech last year. He stopped thinking all cops were bad. That meant something." Micah nodded. "Then prove him right." By the time spring bloomed, the Row Collective had launched its second anthology, What Grows from the Ashes. The dedication read, "For the fathers we lost and the stories we're still telling." Publishers called. Networks offered deals. But Micah turned most of it down. He didn't want his grief monetized. He didn't want to be a brand. What he did want was space. For others. For truth. For healing. He kept writing. Kept mentoring. Kept showing up. At 14, he stood at the dedication of a new community center named after Kendrick Rowe. Not because of how he died, but because of how he lived. Building, feeding, loving. The center offered mental health services, legal aid, and youth workshops. At the ceremony, Micah stood before the crowd and simply said, "This is not a monument to pain. It's a promise to the living." And everyone, even the hard men in the back with crossed arms, nodded. Years passed, slowly, like years do. Micah graduated high school with honors, went to college, majored in creative writing and public policy. He published 2 more books. He never forgot where he came from, never stopped visiting the mural, never stopped telling Kendrick's jokes or singing along to his father's old records. And one day, years later, a little boy raised his hand at one of Micah's readings and asked, "Did pointing at the cop make you feel powerful?" Micah paused. "No," he said slowly. "It made me feel alone, but telling the story afterward that made me feel powerful." The boy nodded. Micah leaned forward. "But you don't have to wait for pain to tell your truth. You can start now. With joy. With laughter. With love." That boy smiled, took out a notebook, and began to write. Micah walked off stage that day into the afternoon sun. His voice, once a cry in the dark, had become a torch. And all around him, new hands are reaching out not for rescue, but for the light. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.